Okay, let's get started. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks to everyone for participating today. Welcome to the M13 webinar on best practices for compensation in the new world of work. I appreciate everyone joining. I know there's a lot going on in the world, and so we certainly appreciate you spending an hour with us. We have a great, hopefully both informative and interesting session for you today. We're going to be focusing around best practices for compensation. So it's a pretty timely topic. Companies are looking at budgets for the year. They're doing planning for next year. It's a time of year when many organizations are doing both performance and compensation reviews in tandem. And certainly with more and more companies and more teams becoming fully distributed, they're wondering how this affects the way they think about compensation in the market. And so we're very lucky, and I'm personally thrilled to have two experts in the space to help us work through these issues and through other issues. And so with that, I'm going to ask our two panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what they do. Sam, I'd love to hear about the work you do at Grayscalable, and Bethany, please share a little background on Compass.
Great, I'll get started. Hi, I'm Sam Feldman. I work for Grayscalable. We are an HR consulting firm that specializes in helping quickly growing startups. Specifically, we have like a recruiting arm, an HR services team, and where I spend all my time is on our compensation and analytics practice. So my background is originally in HR programs and in general people analytics, but answering the question, are we paying people fairly, and how do we set up our practices so that we can do that is where I spend about 99% of my time now, since we started building out the service about 5 years ago. Since then, we've probably worked with about 100 plus companies to help answer that question. And with that, I will send it over to Bethany.
Yeah, Bethany, please talk a little about kind of who you are and the cool product you've built.
Hi, so my name is Bethany. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Compass. Compass is a compensation intelligence platform, and what we do is we are just laser focused on helping companies be great at how you pay people. And what that means is that we provide insights, analytics, workflows to help people run through their raise cycles, and all the way through to employee statements and manager tools to help educate them about how compensation really works.
Awesome. We couldn't have two better experts helping us out today. So what I want to start with is just some of the basics. We certainly have companies that are still trying to figure out how they think about compensation. So I'd love to hear from both of you from the different perspectives. Talk a little about like what total compensation means to you, right? You know, when you're building your organization at first and you're first thinking about compensation isn't just a cash salary, right? There's so much more to it. And I'd love to hear how you think about it, how companies should think about it. What are some of the first things companies should think about when they're building their own compensation philosophy?
Sam, you should start on this one. This is much more your thing than mine.
Yes. Okay, so when we think about compensation philosophy, a compensation strategy, and it's more than just your salary ranges. It is what your proactive strategy is for how you are managing compensation at your company. That is how you set your salary targets. That is how you think about levels, how you think about how people get promoted and paid and give increases, how that is data supported. And when I say, I think the most important point there is that it's proactive. I think when companies are small, one of the ways that pay changes the most is an employee comes to you and says, I got an offer, or this person makes more than me, or I want more money. But having a framework and a philosophy and a strategy to be able to say, okay, we review pay this many times a year. This is the market percentile that we're targeting. We expect this percentage increases on our merit cycle. This is what performance looks like. This is how you move up in the organization. This is how you get promoted, is all part of putting together a proactive compensation strategy. And how big you are and how fast you're growing and the types of roles you have will all kind of dictate when you need to implement that when. But they are all together. And also one thing we haven't really touched on is how base, bonus, and equity all play in together, and all the total parts of compensation, and how job function plays in and geography plays in, which I think we will all touch on.
We're going to talk about all that stuff. What is, either for you, Sam, or Hugh, what is the idea around compensation philosophy? Is that something companies need to have, and how should they think about that?
Well, from where I'm sitting, I think that a compensation philosophy for a company has to follow the company's strategic overall goals. And compensation is a supporting function that helps the company run better. And sometimes especially HR professionals, are put in a position where you're told, like, well, now just go figure out comp, right? Just go figure it out.
Yeah.
And when it comes down to it, what you really need to do is, as a company, you have to ask yourself some really hard introspective questions, like, who are we? What do we value? Where do we want to sit in the market? What's our balance of kind of like mission to cash, and how we talk about why we're here and what we're doing, and that can shift over time, right? But doing a lot of that introspection is the most important first thing that you have to do. And then from there, how do all of our processes, all of the things that we do, support those more existential questions? Compensation philosophy is one of those things. So from that perspective, if you think about it from, are we going to be heavier, even as an early stage company, are we going to pay less in cash but more in benefits, because we recognize that maybe we were going to be somewhere that's really friendly for parents, and so we want to have a different benefits package? Like, what are the things that are valuable to you at different stages, I think is the thing that all plays in for that.
I think that's such a thoughtful perspective. You know, when we work with companies in our early portfolio, one of the things we ask them is, like, you know, your people operations ties to your culture, it ties to your values, right? What do you want to compete on? Why do you want people to work here? Do you want people to work in your company because they can make more money than anyone else, because they believe in the values, they believe in the mission, they have caring benefits? Do you want people to be paid market comp now? Do you want to create long-term incentives around equity? Those are all important questions that we encourage founders to look at in a very early stage. And I know that's things that you help out, Sam, in the companies as you're building out their people operations system.
Yeah, I think one thing I would add that actually I think started as something I said as a joke that became very true is that compensation is about 20% data and 80% how you communicate it effectively to the organization. There's a really great, and Matt, I'll send you the link later so we can circulate it. There's a really great there's like a 2-page Harvard Business Review paper that came out years ago, but it's talking about how 2/3 of people feel that they're paid unfairly. Okay. I think Bethany and I are.
It's so important. Like, compensate, and I think it's similar to what you said, right? Like, compensation is not just about, I know we're all kind of nerds and geeks around the data and things like that, but we totally are. But compensation is so much about emotion and feeling, right? It's about which is what you said, it's about feeling paid fairly, because that is such 100%. A subjective thing.
And it is, and the paper actually showed that like 2/3 of people, like one thing that can mitigate even low pay is communicating effectively. And we've seen this actually in there's a client we had where their scores on that. So a lot of times people come to us either because there's pressure from a career ladder perspective, or because they've got like one of the data points they're bringing to us. Yes. One of the data points they're bringing to us is a score has dropped, or there's been a very low score on, I believe I'm paid fairly for the work I perform. Don't worry, that's going to be one of your lowest scores usually anyway.
Always,
But what's so interesting is, even though it's always one of the lowest scores, it's almost also always one of the lowest drivers of overall engagement, right? It actually doesn't tie to, it's a raw score, but it doesn't impact how people are feeling.
Exactly. And one of the things that we found with like one client, it warms my heart that this was the full end-to-end story, was that they dropped in those numbers, and we did a full levels compensation bands. We did a full employee all hands. Like, this was like a 6-month long project. We did a full employee all hands. And this was not a company that paid very highly. And it's not a company that had big market corrections. These are not people who were getting like $5,000 and $10,000 corrections. Almost no one's pay really changed that dramatically, but the score doubled the next time because employees felt that they understood why they were paying the percentile in the market they were relative, and they felt trust in the system, that the system was fair. They were actually lower in the market than a lot of our clients, but it's amazing how relative it is to an organization, and it's really about how employees feel.
So when you work,
oh, sorry, Matt.
No, go ahead,
don't you find, Sam, that when you're, so this is something we run into a lot at Compass, because we provide a lot of tools to help companies improve their general pay transparency approaches through complex comp. And one of the things that we find a lot is that when you start to talk about pay transparency, so a lot of times people jump to the conclusion that pay transparency means we're going to post everybody's salary on the wiki, right? And in practice, pay transparency, from my perspective, means basically that every employee, first of all, you always have some because everyone knows how much they get paid. So like, there's always a little already.
Yeah.
But then, pay transparency means that every employee understands why they make how much money they make and how they can make more. Like fundamentally, that's it. Everything for pay transparency plays into that. And you could list everybody's salaries on the wiki, and you still don't really have pay transparency because nobody knows how to move their own personal position.
They know the output, but they don't know the process.
Yeah,
for getting there,
exactly.
Right? Which in some ways is actually more confusing.
One thing I would also say, and I think this takes the conversation down the river a little bit to pay transparency, but I want to make sure I don't forget to make this point, because we get that question a ton too, that a lot of people think pay transparency means either we know exactly what Bethany's saying, we know what everybody makes, or that all salary bands for every group are going to be transparent to the whole organization. And some for some organizations that can work, but it has to start from the top, and it has to start from a place of a philosophy and a strategy. Otherwise, to release all that data without the context, without the managers having the ability to speak clearly to it, that someone might be low in a salary range or high in a salary range for a specific number of given reasons, like tenure, performance, market pressure, whatever it is, it needs to come down from the top, and it needs to be intentional. It can't just be we value transparency, and therefore we release everything without any explanation.
I think that's a great segue. Let's talk a little bit about kind of like building out ranges, and so much of what we're talking about is kind of the early stages, like building out the architecture, right? And ranges are part of it. Obviously, there's the big ones with Radford or OptionBet, Gray Scalable, Compass has those as well. How should founders think about kind of comp ranges? How should they build it? How should they think about where to set their employees, how to communicate what they mean? Let's talk about some of the experience that you both have, because this is clearly an area of expertise for you too.
Okay. The first thing I will say when we do this, most of the clients we work with are anywhere from 30 to a few hundred people. The first thing we do is, and we call our product compensation and levels, and it's because we should probably switch the name to levels and compensation.
Yeah. And help distinguish between the two, because I think they're so important for the group too.
Exactly. So one of the reasons we specialize in the startup world, as opposed to like, don't get me wrong, there's wonderful market data out there, big, robust market data sets. But one of the reasons the consulting side works well is because levels are so foundational to an organization. And someone who you gave the title, and I'm going to use just a random example, like director of marketing to, when you were 50 people, is not necessarily what the market would benchmark as a director level role now. So getting, like if you're first starting out, understanding where people levels are, there's probably two foundational things: understanding where employees are level wise in the market. There's also understanding who you are, what size and who you are as an organization, and where you need to compete from like a percentile perspective. And Bethany touched on this previously too, about like what that means in terms of the balance of, when companies are small, they're slightly lower cash, higher equity. And as they come up, higher cash, lower equity. When you get much bigger, we're talking like hundreds of people, becomes slightly more likely you'll have like a cash bonus program. Like there's ways that everything, and bonuses and benefits shift upwards as you get bigger. Like there's ways that everything shifts and moves as time goes on. So understanding where you're positioned in the market and what's a good, healthy place to compete in, as well as making sure employees are benchmarked to the right level in the market, are probably the two foundational things in terms of setup. And that's before you even get to the market data.
Yeah, and we tend to talk to companies who are a little bit later. So our companies that we work with tend to be a few hundred to several thousand. And usually they've gone through at least one or two versions of revisiting their levels, our levels giving us the opportunity for professional growth that our company is looking for. Are we giving the career trajectory we want for our employees? What are we balancing for cash versus stock? We often talk with companies during this really critical moment when they're making that transition from talking about stock, about like percentage of ownership or number of shares. And they're making that transition into talking about things like money at work and value and opportunity for growth. And it's an interesting sort of transition period, kind of like Sam's talking about. You sort of go through these stages as you're growing, if you're successful, and being able to think about it from a position of like, you have these early employees who took a lot of risk, and then it's de-risked as you go later in the company. And so how do you find the balance where you both can attract employees that are right for the size of the company where you are now? And if you're working to retain some of your very earliest employees, who are not always the right people to take you to know what's next, but sometimes they really want to keep them forever, how do you continue to motivate them, and how do you bring them into a range that's appropriate for the work that they're doing now, so they aren't just anchored to a very early low cash comp for some arbitrary reason?
So is it too broad to say that early on in a life cycle, employees typically will be in the lower end of traditional ranges and they go up? Is that a hard and fast rule? Are there times where companies should be thinking about that stuff?
Doesn't it comparing your comp though, Sam, when you say that it depends on who you're comping to? Like if you're an early stage company comparing to early stage companies, maybe not.
I'll say, and actually that's a perfect segue, because when the one thing I would say, almost like to shift the language a little bit, is not that you're paying them low in range, is that you're paying a lower market percentile because of who you're competing with. So like the philosophy, a lot of companies will ask us to, or a lot of the ways people look at data, and it's a fine way to look at data, is they pre-filter the data. They say, what are we paying for other Series B at this revenue and this employee size? But 50th percentile of that market is not necessarily helpful if you don't know where the broader market sits. So we come from the philosophy of, what do the lowest paying companies up to the FANGs pay? And where as a startup in that market do other companies like you normally target? And we, spoiler, like most companies that are like Series B, C, D, generally target somewhere around the 50th to 60th percentile of that broader market. So the top of those ranges have some nice overlap with the bottom of like a Facebook range, those type of considerations. But it's more about when you're very small, when you're like under 50 employees, and your like equity is still a huge factor there, you're generally probably paying 25th, 30th percentile on average. Yep. And it's how that anchor shifts up over time.
Talk a little bit more about this, which both of you touch on, this cash versus equity, and obviously at different stages the value of each is different, but how do companies think about kind of the overall compensation and how they compete on cash, and how they communicate things around the value of equity as well? Are those things that should feel fixed? Should they be short-term, long-term? Should they be negotiated? I'd love to hear your kind of experience and best practices around that stuff.
Well, again, we tend to talk with companies who are a little bit later stage, just not all the way necessarily. We do have some public companies, but the majority of our companies are sort of in the B through late stage venture size. And it's an interesting moment where they're having to reckon with choices that they made earlier in their life. And a lot of that reckoning comes from emotionally driven decisions that they made when they were trying to get that one person, they were trying to do this thing or another. The balance of equity to cash typically shifts. You do tend to be more equity heavy early on, because the thing that you're selling is two things. Generally, I think when you're doing a very early stage company, you're selling, this is your company now. Coming to us early means that you're really part of it. It's not like giant ownership typically, but like the upside of like the things you do matter fundamentally to the success of the company, and we want you to have an opportunity for reward of that. And so you want that to be a little more balanced on the risk. As companies go further along and the risk goes down, the amount of the risk to the companies being successful goes down because the company has lived longer. The amount of cash you can usually demand in a role tends to go up, and in exchange you get less on your stock. It really comes down to the storytelling you're doing on how you're not just hiring people, but retaining people and being consistent in that story. So you're telling your very early stage company, I believe, I hope, a truthful story that you believe, which is, look, we believe in what we're doing really matters, it's important, it's impactful, and we don't have Facebook money, but you know what we do have? We've got upside and opportunity. We can change the world and we can do well by doing good, something similar to that. As time goes on, you end up with a larger workforce and you end up with, okay, like we're a good safe place for you. Yes, there's upside for you and it's less risky, but we're a safe place for you and you can build your career here and grow and develop in different ways. So I think it's about that transition. I would say something that you had mentioned was sort of the negotiation statement there, which is the one thing I'm going to go back to, which is I think it's really common to have to negotiate to some extent or another. Putting some boundaries on where you'll negotiate, I think, is really useful. And some companies like to give people options and say, you can do more cash or you can do more stock, and we'll let you pick which one. And that's a big part of the reckoning we often run into with our companies, is they made those opportunities available to early employees, and now they're trying to figure out what they're going to do about it because they sort of didn't plan all the way forward with it.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to jump right on that. And it's one of the things there's always, particularly, I think when we're talking about it, like executive roles, that is more common, the negotiation. But when we're talking about a more like general employee population, one of the things that we notice too, same thing, we get the data and we're like, what happens is a lot of those people that took that risk and took higher equity, lower cash, get double rewarded. Because in order to correct, like let's say you're now 150 people and you're setting your salary bands to the 50th percentile of the tech market, and the person that took the risk is now going to be market corrected. They're no longer going to have, it's going to be only 1 year later, and they're not going to have differentiated pay from the person who took higher salary, lower stock. And now they've been double rewarded within 12 to 18 months, they've been double rewarded for that. And there is, well, I think we'll probably get into this when we talk about pay equity too, is like this, the who takes higher, especially when we've seen it in our data, the who takes higher risk when it's offered tends to favor a certain section of the population. It tends to be people who have either been in startups before. We see a lot more men than women who are able to take those risks, people without families who are able to take lower cash. And I would, for the sake of equity, sorry, it's so, sometimes I find it very frustrating because to talk about equity options, like equity as stock and equity as pay equity.
We need a new word in compensation.
It makes some of my presentations very difficult. But to be more equitable at a company, it sometimes helps if the negotiation is only within a very narrow range,
right?
In that way.
It's a great transition, right? Because in theory, the idea behind ranges and structures is you want to create a predictable approach both for running your business, and you also want to create conditions where, within reason, we'll talk about this, people are generally getting paid the same amount for impact and work as someone else, right? And one of the reasons why, and then obviously in addition to kind of all the things you talk about, there's tons of research says, when you negotiate, that typically advantages people from different demographic backgrounds. And there's all sorts of research supporting that as well. So on one hand, you have to, creating that system of equality and structure and consistency. And there's a valued school of thought that says, you want to let leaders invest differentially how they want, and you want managers to own their own process and own their own hires, and you want to encourage negotiation. How do you think about all those issues around consistency and equality while also differentiating in that way? Or is that a false choice?
I don't think it's a false choice. I think that's actually coming back to like what Bethany's like product does, what we consult on. Having those salary ranges and knowing where the bounds are is very helpful. So salary ranges themselves are usually wide enough that it can support career growth without forcing a promotion. But they're also narrow enough to support internal equity between employees. So that once we set up salary ranges with clients, one of the things that when they say like, okay, how do we move forward with this? We say, okay, if you're going to go, basically you can apply those salary ranges to your headcount plan. And one of the things we say, we say two things. One, look at the salary ranges, but also look at where people are paid in them. If you want to shoot for the midpoint, but everyone at your company is just slightly below midpoint, you want to kind of be mindful of that when you're talking to candidates and negotiation is happening. But even if you don't have those salary ranges, because I know we're talking about I know M13 has some smaller companies, you want to at least be this is where levels come in of like, who is this person's peer? And we want to make sure that we're being at least internally consistent so that when we do set salary ranges, we're able, like, we're not making huge market corrections, or we haven't done anything historically wrong for 3 years in a row.
Yeah, so much of that is you want to kind of reward for impact and you want to reward for performance, but then there's a question of what variance in performance are you even willing to tolerate versus just keeping underperformers at all, right? And I think that's so much of the differentiation. I know you're going to say something, Bethany. Sorry.
One of the things that I'm a huge fan of is even if you don't have salary ranges set yet, and even if you aren't publicizing to everybody what you're doing as a founder, or as a HR person who's supporting a small organization, like holding the company accountable for determining at time of hire what you think somebody's level is, even if you don't have anything else associated with that, is hugely important, because it comes back to exactly what Matt's talking about how you measure for performance, right? Because we measure performance for someone we determine to be like an E3, in engineering, is very different than an E6. And if we hired somebody to be an E6 and we went through all of the work of saying, oh, we're going to pay this guy so much, he's going to be our 10x engineer, he's going to do all this stuff for us. And then you get in 6 months later, you give him time, right? And then you get in 6 months later, you're like, this guy is just not an E6. Having that in a way that you can reference helps you hold yourself accountable as the company to be able to make hard
and so
choices.
much of that is around kind of just building a scalable structure. It's not just about comp, it's about recruiting, right? Like we've all seen this where someone's going out and they're looking to hire a manager and they get this incredible candidate and they're like, we've got to bring them in as a director, right? And obviously there's all sorts of kind of comp issues but then the question is, well, what if you actually looked for a director in the first place, right? What might you have gotten? And so I think that idea about, figuring out what you want early on in the process and then holding as part of building your organization actually makes it easier to kind of stick to those ranges. How about like differential performance or variable performance? At what stage should companies think about things like bonus? Should they ever? Are there best practices that you see around that? In a way of building that scalable organization?
I can jump in if you want.
Well, sales always does this. So can I assume we're not talking about sales?
That's always my first qualifier too. We're not talking about variable.
I mean, there's questions whether it's applicable to both or why it should be different other than the way it's been done before. But let's stick with regular organizations.
I would say there's probably
so not sales.
Not maybe. Sales. So there's probably three ways like that you can, because there's how you reward performance in terms of how you raise people's salaries. There's how you reward performance about whether you or not you have a bonus plan. And if you have a bonus plan, what are the mechanics of what you value and how you measure performance? The bigger it is, if for anybody listening who's in a smaller company, I think I mentioned this before, it is very common to not have a bonus program. Very, very common. If you're under 200 employees, particularly for like under like VP and above, and you don't have a bonus program and you're like 100 people, that you're very normal. The thing that's so important about paying for performance in a bonus program is we've actually been hired as many times to help institute a bonus program as we have to take one away, because it is actually similarly to the transparency conversation. Unless you have an organization with leadership and people managers and an HR support where you can support goal-driven performance management, where the bonus is actually meaningful and not just a target that's an expected thing, or it's applied subjectively and strangely across the organization, it sometimes causes a lot more problems than it solves. And we've actually been hired a handful of times to figure out the formula for moving that into base or removing it altogether until the company feels it has a management structure that can really make a bonus program, a non-sales, we're talking about people who have like annual targets, a bonus program meaningful. And that is why, because most companies that are like 50 to 200 people don't have the HR,
good at the process.
They don't have HR infrastructure or people operations in place to support that yet in a fair, consistent way.
And I think that goes back to what we talked about earlier about tying your people ops and your compensation to your values, right? Do you want to reward individual behavior, collaborative behavior, competitive behavior? Do you potentially bonus on team outcomes versus individual? Those are all decisions around how people are going to work together, right? So thinking about those, and you want your all of your performance tied to compensation to drive the actual behaviors you want to see during the year. And to your point, Sam, if you haven't actually thought about that, or you don't have a good HR infrastructure to kind of manage and coach and develop that stuff, you're really just picking numbers out of a hat. And, that might feel great for managers because they get that kind of power, but it's not always necessarily the most scalable or repeatable thing. And it certainly doesn't feel great for employees if they feel they're on the short end of that conversation. Shifting topics, I know this is a big one, and then I'd love to hear some questions from the people in the audience. Obviously, kind of compensation issues related to relocation and distributed teams is such a big trend right now, and so many companies are working through it. We have people moving from high cost markets to other cost markets, and people just moving different places. And there are questions around, what do you do with employees when they move? We have teams that are distributed from the beginning and are trying to think about a scalable comp approach. How do you think about that issue that's on so many people's minds right now? And what best practice have you seen, and what mistakes have you seen as well? I'll let you start, Sam.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Sam, you should take this one first.
Great. This is Matt, this is the hugest question that we get right now this year, is what happens to pay when employees move? So I'm going to take us back to pre-COVID times. It is
Please do.
So, yeah, right. It is if I was talking to a client as of the first week of March last year, it is a very common market best practice to set your salary ranges based on like the metro area and market rate and like that the labor market in that area. Like it is across all the big company, like this is a very standard practice that has been longstanding between real estate, facilities, workforce planning, finance, and HR teams, where how people are paid relative to like New York or San Francisco rates has always been a thing. The other big thing I always say when we're talking to clients is that I want to make sure that we're not conflating cost of living with cost of labor, or market pay differentials, whatever terminology you want to use. I think a lot of employees fear that if they move from New York to Omaha and the pay and in Omaha the cost of living is half, that their salary that means there's a linear relationship to their pay, and their pay is going to get cut in half. The lines are parallel, but they are very, very different. So like most pay relative to New York or San Francisco is only going to be at max maybe a 20% or 25% differential. So someone moving from New York to Denver, we're talking about maybe 8 or 10% differential. And that is a very common practice. And the reason it's a really common practice, and actually still as we move into COVID times, when we still, particularly for our larger clients, very much still recommend is that if you say philosophically, we pay the 50th percentile of the tech market, it is a rough, in terms of fairness. I think there's I know we've all talked about this before, like, I think there's the snap employee, I have it too as an internal employee, like, hey, this is the value I bring to the company. Why would you change my pay because I moved? But if you're going to say, hey, we pay the 60th percentile of the market, but you pay 95th percentile for everyone outside of the New York area, is that fair? So there's like a philosophical fairness piece here as well. And I think now with like COVID time situation, we would say anyone who's like kind of when we're in temporary times before we kind of make our back to office plans, we're not suggesting that anybody permanently shift people's pay until this becomes a permanent thing. And then especially, again, I'm not sure the size of companies in the audience, but if you're really small, and it really depends, one, on the volume of employees moving. If a couple employees move and it would kill morale to adjust people's pay down, you do not need to. Philosophically, I still think there should be a market-based strategy for big companies. But also one strategy, I apologize, I've been talking for a while, but one thing.
That's why you're here.
One thing we often see, and we've seen with a couple companies that are somewhere in like the 50 to 200 range, is that, hey, okay, when the dust settles and you move, we will evaluate where you sit and see if that needs to be market corrected. So someone could be, and keep in mind, like I said, these salary differentials might only be 10% different. Like the salary ranges might only be 10% different. So someone might sit in low to middle in the New York market and they move to Denver or Atlanta or something, and they're actually still well within range and you don't need to adjust them. Yeah. So there's that, which is another plug.
And then there's a question, and then I want to go to you, Bethany, in a second, but then there's a question of, do you adjust salaries retroactively, or do you just slow the growth proactively to kind of flatten them out? There's those type of questions as well, right?
I think that the answer is both. So we've had some companies who say, okay, once the dust settles, and if you have permanently moved to a location that is at a significant discount to our headquarters, we will adjust pay. We've had companies that are 200 to 500 say that, and a lot of the big tech companies are saying that too. We've had a handful take that softer approach, the second one you mentioned, to say like, we are not going to change anybody's pay, but we're going to, when it comes time for merit increases, we might evaluate where you now sit in band, and the growth might be a little bit slower, or it might not be. There's a lot of custom approaches to this. And to be fair, I don't want to pretend to be an expert on it. The dust still has to settle on what this is going to mean for.
That's right. And that's what I was going to ask you, Bethany. You know, obviously the world is changing, like the market is changing, right? I've always seen that the market for engineers or technical talent is probably different than non-technical talent. And you have such good visibility of that. Are you seeing markets and ranges change and the world change just given what's going on with location and distributed teams?
Well, we've had a variety of company approaches that we've worked with already, like inside the customers that we work with. Like one of our partner companies is GitLab, and they are very transparent and very well known for publishing like all of their location factors that they use. If you want to know how much a job would pay in Peoria, you can look it up on their website. Like they've got it for you. And all the way through to companies who are just much more traditional and a little more I would say a little less publicly expressive about their compensation numbers. The big thing though is that Sam said is totally true, which is the companies that are already were multi-location, I think already had the idea of local market rates as part of their company philosophy. If you had an office in Austin, an office in New York, and an office in Seattle, they were probably slightly different from each other already. So you already sort of had this idea of like, what your relocation would be like. What is your relocation package if somebody goes between those? And therefore, like people are sort of, companies tend to be following that model sort of. I do see a lot of companies sort of waiting till the dust settles. We also have, there are a number of companies, and we saw this happen relatively early on, like what happened with Facebook, when they called it, what happened with, I think Figma actually called it a little more recently, which was, we're going to stay remote. We're just calling it. We're just going to do it. We're staying remote because ambiguity, just the ambiguity of not knowing when things were going to make come to some sort of like conclusion has its own drag on the business, right? So just making a decision that you're going to allow something lets you sort of just take action and move forward. And we've seen a lot of companies doing that. In that bucket, though, companies are taking a number of approaches similar to what Sam was talking about. Some are saying, you know, we're not going to make significant changes now. Some, for example, Figma was very public about what they did, was they said, we're never going to make people come back in the office full time. If you're tied to a hub, you'll get paid for that hub. We expect you in the office a couple days a week. And then if you are outside the range of a hub, then you'll get paid a local rate, and we're going to start hiring for local rates today, and everyone else gets adjusted in 6 months. Something that Facebook, I think, did really well, something that I think Figma has done really well, and some other companies who have been making these decisions to make the changes as people move, is just being really clear and giving people lots of runway to know, like, we're going to make these changes, we're going to give you an idea of what that change is going to look like. We're going to give you time to make a decision for your life. We're not going to say, go to Boise, buy a house, and then we're going to tell you that you don't make the money you thought you made when you got the mortgage. The companies that we see that are doing this really well are really emphasizing consistency and communication. And those two things are just vitally important.
Makes sense. One related question, I just want to put a call out for questions from the audience for our panelists. Please just throw them into the chat window. But on the other side, are there issues that employees need to think about when it comes to kind of relocation from a compensation perspective? Are there tax considerations? Are there other things that both companies and employees need to think about when they're moving or nomading or whatever they're doing?
I would say the one thing that I wish employees understood better, and I'm sure Sam has others of these, but the one thing I just want to emphasize is that it is not as simple as just the salary changes. Your company may not be positioned to support you as a full-time employee in some random location. It doesn't, just because the company may not have the structure to do it, they may not be set up to do it. If your company is on a PEO, and smaller companies tend to be on PEOs, then you're probably fine, actually. Like smaller companies, we're on PEOs, people can go wherever, it's somebody else's problem to deal with it. That's what we pay the PEO for. But when you get into a larger organization, you start to think about things like compliance, you start to think about things like local taxation requirements, and are you staffed as a company to be able to take on the organizational overhead to support in your 50-person company employees in 30 states, right?
Yeah.
And not everybody is.
And same thing, actually, one thing I've seen from employee questions too, that I was like, oh yeah, that's a big one, but we don't deal with as much in startups, is the international component. We're talking just domestic states, but people are like, well, why can't I go work from this other country? And then you just triple the amount of like the rules and the guidelines, and then all of a sudden you're talking about data restrictions. It is you have, and this is part of that the communication plan to employees about why and what and how and what counts.
And what counts, yeah. And then you have all the issues around things like, and that's a really good point about the data restrictions, depending on the kind of employee you are, the access to company information you have. You have all sorts of different things that can happen. Contract restrictions that might be inside your SaaS agreement with your customers may restrict their data being moved around. There's just a lot of complexity that is very difficult to anticipate. And I know that we have we made a reference to this a little bit earlier, but when we're in absence of a story, we write our own story. And our own story that we write for ourselves is usually bad. Honestly, it's usually something bad is happening. I'm not making as much money as I should. Somebody's not treating me as well as they should. It tends to be that, honestly. And I think that this is something where the burden of that extraordinary and consistent communication around not just what you can accommodate, but why you can accommodate it. It's a lot of energy to put into doing it and being consistent and delivering it in different channels so that people have different ways that they can absorb the information. But in absence of that, you end up with a lot of sort of painful people cleanup, which is never fun.
We have a question from the audience. I assume this is for you, Sam, but feel free to kind of weigh in, Bethany, about talking a little bit more about the difference between cost of labor versus cost of living and what you would recommend in differentiating between the two.
Sure. So cost of living is I don't deal with cost of living too much because maybe cost of living, there's probably I want to say two ways of thinking about this. Sorry, my brain's catching up. There's cost of living in terms of a lot of people think about this in like what kind of increases they should give everybody every year. And I would actually say frame that more as like a merit increase as opposed to a cost of living adjustment. That way it's not a given and you can reward performance. So that's bucket one. The cost of living in terms of how you set your salary ranges would be and there's lots of calculators out there for this, but what the differential is to live in a city that like $100,000 in San Francisco is actually actually for ease sake, we'll say is the same as having $200,000 in another city. Whereas when we think about cost of labor or the market or market compensation data, we say that the average salary for X role is $100,000 in San Francisco, and it's $85,000 in another city. So that data comes from lots of places. There's lots of great market data providers, but the way that that's normally organized is into market best practice is generally to do this by like geography. So we say like something like geography A is like New York. Geography B is like you kind of group metro areas that pay similarly. It would be like Boston and DC. Yeah. And C is like Chicago and Denver. And like you go that way in terms of how you set your salary ranges.
So in fact, $100,000 of purchasing power in San Francisco may be $160,000 of purchasing power in another place, right?
Yes.
They're definitely trade-offs.
Yes. And
how about on the
Sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was gonna say what it really means is it is very expensive to live in New York and San Francisco. That's one of the things when it comes to like what happens to pay when employees move is part of that gentle communication that a $10,000 cut to your salary, even when you consider like taxes, but a $10,000 cut to your salary is still, you're still doing better cost of living wise than you would in a San Francisco or New York. And also the funny thing, separately, you don't necessarily need to communicate this to employees, is the taxes piece. Sometimes you can take a pay cut, and because of the taxes in the place you're moving to, you actually may take home more pay than you did when you were in San Francisco.
Yep. How about on the equity side? So Justin asked a question. We obviously, so much of this relocation conversation is around cash comp, but what about equity? Have you seen companies renegotiate equity adjustments when teams are going remote?
Great question. No.
Should they? Does that say anything about how you think about comp?
No, but there's two ways you do it. Right. Sorry, Sam, go.
So like, and that's actually, it's a perfect way to start conceptualizing, like when we think about what someone's someone's worth in the market from a benchmark salary perspective, that's one thing, but how you value what percentage ownership people should have as a result of their level is another thing. And that does not have a geographical component. The exception being international.
And in early stage, you're talking more about early stage, right? Yeah. So when you get to later stage companies, you start to think about equity as you more consistently think about equity as its potential cash value. And then you start to talk about it as like a total comp package that has a total value of 300, but 200 of that is stock. Like that's how you sort of do that in the later stage companies. In any case, there's basically two ways that people are doing equity stake conversations, right? You're either saying an engineer at this level gets this number of shares, boom, that's it. Or you say, you get the equivalent of 1 year of salary in the location where you are using this target number of this target share price. So it might not be 10,000 if you move to Omaha, it might be 8,000. Those are but as long as you're consistent, that's the thing that matters the most.
And that's an interesting reframing of the whole comp versus equity conversation, right? Do you see equity as a way to grant a certain percentage of ownership, right, for long-term incentive? Or do you look at equity purely in the compensation perspective, saying this is worth X dollars, and you think about it? And there's no right answer for me. It is a philosophical perspective, but I know that's kind of where you live every day, Bethany.
It's also stage of the company. I mean, I think the same probably agree. Like, I mean, it really comes down to, early in the company, we're making a pitch and we're connecting people and we're like, look, this is part of your ownership in the company. The place, like I mentioned earlier, where we spend a lot of time working with companies is when they're making the transition from talking about it as a percentage of ownership to talking about it as like potentially real money, if that makes sense. I mean, I don't want to be flip about it. As a founder, like I believe everybody believes in our business, but to some extent, we all know that like pre-seed company shares are like lottery tickets. You know what I mean? Like you really hope they're going to play out. And so you're buying in for the potential of them. Whereas if you're getting RSUs from, a later stage company, the likelihood of those being worth real, something you can actually convert into cash,
can calculate
is different.
Yeah. And actually the value proposition to employees and why they join, it's all connected. Like when you're very small, you're selling a really valuable lottery ticket.
And the dream. And the work and the feeling of doing it. Yeah, and there's all that stuff.
But even when you're like 100 people, the value, and you're recruiting and building out the team of software engineers, how you communicate and what they're expecting from a market competitive perspective is going to, and how it's communicated to them is different than what the story you need to tell to very early stage employees.
Are there any best practices, is a question from Hunter, are there any best practices or resources that you recommend for early stage startup, Series A, Series B, for thinking about option grants and refreshes?
So many people get this advice from your board.
Yeah.
I would say one thing that's not going to make me super popular. I'll say two things actually. One of them is what VCs tell you about what the best way is to manage your equity pool as a founder, and that'll trickle into, of course, that would not be handed directly into HR or finance to manage that. Doesn't necessarily translate into what like human people who are accepting or not accepting offers can deal with. For example, you could look up something like they would call boxcar grant style, and those never sold. Like human beings would never sign up for them, even if you could tell them they were going to make more money on the other side. They just
will you explain to the audience what those are?
It has to do with taking a smaller initial grant with the upside of having larger continuous grants. But as a the emotions of signing up for a job, you want that big initial grant, right?
Yeah, and you want to feel that they invested in you in the same way you've
Yeah.
invested in them, right?
Even though
Yeah.
it doesn't really turn into a difference, and it's easier to manage your equity pool and stuff like that. So I would say that the advice that VCs give you about how to do this is not necessarily tied, your board would give you, or not necessarily tied to what actually helps you close. The other thing I would say around this is thinking hard about, remember when you are making a decision on any of these things, I know I'm not quite answering the question on best practices, but I'll tell you my other thing here, which is long exercise windows are great for recruiting and not good for retention. So remember, you have to think about the entire employee life cycle, no matter which clever thing you want to do.
So
right?
having a
Think about the
90-day
entire
exercise
employee life
window you
cycle.
think is good, or you prefer longer ones?
I think that they all have costs and benefits, and I think that the 5-year exercise window makes it really hard to retain somebody. If you aren't willing to slap a big grant on them, they'll leave at 3 years because they've already got a bunch. I think that which they're getting more common, right? I think 90 days personally is pretty short, but as a founder, I also have to consider, when I'm structuring my company, what is going to cause me less friction when I fundraise next time. So you always have all these different like things that you're balancing with. So I would say that it's not a new, the thing I would caution companies to do is it is not an, oh, I'm a big fan of early exercise, let people do that. There's no harm to you, just let them do it. But the big thing I would say is that, if you're going to go do some of the novel things that help you with talent acquisition, don't forget at the very beginning, while you're planning this out, what does this look like 2 years from now? What am I going to do for talent retention? And that's the mistake that I see companies make a lot, is they think a lot about pipeline and acquisition and they don't think about retention.
They give up a little bit. They give up the function of that as a long-term incentive, which is what it's supposed to be.
Right.
And it's actually interesting. And that's why we deal, coming to the other side, we deal with refresh grants, is putting one in place. Sometimes companies will wait till people are almost fully vested. Psychologically, and again, this is actually really connected, Bethany, to what you were saying about what the data says and what the advice you're getting says versus what the experience is for employees. So if you're an employee, we recommend at roughly about probably at least at the 2-year mark to consider refresh grants, because psychologically, particularly when we're talking about people below executive levels who don't have that much equity, you can go look for another job if you're half vested or about to be 75% vested. So you want to get ahead of that in terms of planning, particularly, but you
especially
also
if you have a long exercise window, if you have a long exercise window, there's no reason not to leave it 2 or 3 years, because you're going to get you'll get a big higher grant when you go to the next company and stack them up, right?
You start developing your portfolio of new hire grants. But yes, it's a very big balancing act, and it is tough to do. But in terms of, yes, lots of original data comes from VCs. There seems to be one blog post by Fred Wilson that seems to set up everybody's initial equity situation. There's also
is that the Wealthfront blog? Is that the Wealthfront model? Is that the one?
I can't. No, it's not the Wealthfront one. There's literally a very simple one.
There's a Bessemer, there's a Fred one, there's a Bessemer one, and there's the Wealthfront one.
Yes, and I remember the Fred one was the early one that it's a simple model about multipliers based on the type of level in an early stage.
There might be a Henry from Carta one now that actually is a really good one. That's actually a good one.
We're going to send out a bunch of resources. We're going to send a bunch of resources to everyone from Gray, and a bunch of resources from Compass. We'll include those as well. We are we're running up against it. Anything that founders or leaders should do or should not do as we close out? Anything we didn't talk about? Just final piece of advice or resources you want to direct them to?
Pay equity. Do you want to do pay equity, Sam?
Yeah. One thing we haven't covered that has been a huge part of, it's actually been, the Black Lives Matter movement has been really wonderful. About 50% of our clients were doing pay equity with studies before. And now we're probably doing them with almost all of them. And I will say, always measure pay equity. But one of the most important things is measuring, we don't do pay equity studies without measuring representation as well. And that plays a little bit more into like the people at my people analytics background, is that you can't measure what's not there. So you can say we're paying men and women fairly, but if there are no women above manager level, doesn't matter. Action plans, people ops plans come from measuring representation and pay. So that's my plug for pay equity.
My follow on that would be, we talked about whether stock equity is part of a compensation stack. And one of the things that you want to look at is don't just look at cash when you're doing this. The legal requirements to do pay equity analysis are all going to focus on cash. But when it comes right down to, and salaries, really, not even like really bonus structures, looking at like what are the total things that come together to make somebody's pay work, looking to get their cash, their wages or salary, their bonus structure, whatever's happening for their bonuses, how are those being distributed, what's happening with stock grants at hire and then later. And then don't forget, if somebody leaves, being consistent in your severance packages, that's one that bites companies a lot. Nobody ever analyzes that one. But the last thing I would say about this is that if you are going to do local comp, if your company is deciding to do some kind of local comp, what that means is that you have a once in a lifetime opportunity to make pay equity adjustments inside your organization as people move. Because if somebody is on a cost neutral basis, because if somebody who is a highly paid young white guy, let's just say, is moving to a less expensive region, some of that cash comes back in the pool. And if you have somebody who is from an underrepresented group that may be on the lower pay range for your company, and they're moving, say, to Denver, like Sam referenced before, maybe you don't actually change that person's pay, and it shifts them from being at the bottom of the band or below band to being in the middle of the band. You can make significant pay equity improvements inside your company right now, and you will never get this chance again. So don't miss it.
Yeah, and it's a perfect way to end it, because it brings it all full circle, right? The best way to make sure that your processes are as free from bias as possible, the best way to make sure that your systems and your tools and your decisions are as equitable as possible is to build that thoughtfulness and structure into the beginning of the process, right? So the more that you have really thoughtful, scalable, foundational processes around your compensation, the more likely you are to have systems and decisions that reduce as much kind of gender and demographic bias as possible. That is a great place to end it. As I want to thank you both. This was so great. I know we could have gone for 3 hours, but I think it's enough. For everyone who's doing this, we will send out a recording. We're going to be doing something for M13 with Sam, hopefully in the near future. Bethany has an amazing tool and resources we're going to be sharing, so all of you can please take a look at that. We're very lucky to have these two experts with us. I'm very grateful and appreciative. Thank you both very much, and thanks everyone for participating. Bye-bye, everyone.